It all began on an apparently ordinary night in October 2014, in the arid interior of Arizona, in a small town surrounded by dirt roads and hills that time had forgotten. The sun had set hours ago, and the dry air carried that smell of hot dust mixed with rust, a familiar aroma for someone who lived fixing engines and dealing with the silent weight of solitude. Mark Reynolds was a simple man, a mechanic in his mid-40s, who lived life to the rhythm of clanging tools and the silence of nights. Ever since his wife had left, and his son had decided to live with his mother in another city, the house felt too big for one man. Routine kept him going. Wake up early, work until dusk, clean the garage, and gaze at the sky, as if seeking answers in the stars that always seemed too distant. That night, the sky was different. There was a strange opacity, as if the clouds were blocking something more than just light. The wind blew irregularly, piling dry leaves in the corners of the fence. Mark finished putting away his tools, wiped his hands on a cotton rag, and lit a cigarette, watching the small glow fade into the dark. Everything was quiet, too quiet, until a soft, thin, almost childlike voice broke the silence, saying something he would never forget. "Can we stay in your garage for this night?" For a second, he froze. The sound was clear, but it didn't seem to come from a human throat. It was a mix of whisper and vibration, as if the air itself had spoken. Mark looked around, trying to locate who was there. The wall lantern illuminated only part of the yard, revealing elongated shadows. That's when he saw them, 3 small figures, motionless, standing a few meters away. They were about 4.5 feet tall, maybe less, with eyes too large, reflecting the light like liquid mirrors. Their skin shimmered in shades of grey and blue, with a texture reminiscent of the moon's surface under mist. They weren't armed, didn't move aggressively, they just watched, as if waiting for a response. Mark's initial instinct was fear. His heart raced, his body took half a step back, and his mind tried to find a logical explanation. Some prank? Kids in masks? But there was no one around. The nearest town was almost 20 minutes away by car, and that stretch of road rarely saw visitors. The fear soon gave way to another feeling, more confusing and profound: empathy. One of the creatures was trembling, and another was holding the smallest one's arm in a protective gesture, as if saying, "Hold on tight." Mark, for some reason, felt pity. Maybe it was the paternal instinct that had never left him since he'd raised his son alone, or maybe it was just pure humanity, that silent spark that makes us act before we think. He tried to speak, but his voice wouldn't come out. The wind blew hard, and for a moment the generator made the house lights flicker. When the light returned, the 3 were still there, motionless, eyes fixed on him. And then, without understanding why, Mark said, "You can stay, just for tonight." The words escaped like a reflex, and in saying them, he felt a strange peace, the sensation that he had just done something that needed to be done, even without knowing why. The beings moved slowly, like someone afraid of being chased away. The smallest one looked at Mark and tilted its head, a gesture reminiscent of thanks. There was no threat, just exhaustion, and in that moment, the solitary mechanic realized something he had never admitted out loud. It had been a long time since anyone, or anything, had looked at him with trust. As he led them to the garage, Mark noticed how the air seemed different. There was no usual sound of crickets, or the smell of burnt oil that permeated the place. The silence was thick, as if the world had paused to witness that moment. He turned on the dim overhead light, and the trio entered slowly, looking around with restrained curiosity. Shadows danced on the walls, and Mark felt a shiver run down his spine. There was something deeply human in the way they moved: caution, respect, and even shame. As he closed the door, Mark realized that, unknowingly, he had opened another one that separated the ordinary world from something most people would never believe existed. There were no screams, no lights, no invasion. There was just a man, 3 visitors, and a simple phrase that would change the course of his life. He didn't know it yet, but that would be the night the impossible asked for shelter, and he said yes. Inside the garage, the air seemed heavier, as if the space, accustomed only to the smell of grease and rust, now harbored something sacred and unknown. Mark watched the 3 visitors with a mix of curiosity and disbelief. They didn't speak, but communicated with glances and small gestures, like children trying to understand the world for the first time. Their skin reflected the yellowish light of the bulb in shades that shifted softly, oscillating between grey and greenish blue, as if made of a living substance. The smallest one trembled visibly, and Mark, driven by an impulse he didn't understand, grabbed an old blanket and extended it toward it. The simple, automatic gesture seemed to awaken something in the 3. The smallest looked at the blanket and then at Mark, hesitant. What appeared to be the eldest of the group touched the fabric, curious, and an almost human expression crossed its face, surprise. When the smallest wrapped itself in the cloth and pulled it close to its body, a soft voice, with a doubled sound, said, "Warm, thank you." The words vibrated in the air in two frequencies, as if coming from two places at once. Mark stood still, not knowing what to respond. It wasn't the sound that impressed him, but the meaning. It was the first time he heard a voice that, though not human, carried humanity in every syllable. He sat down in a rusty chair, keeping some distance, watching them with his heart pounding. He didn't know if he should call someone, record the moment, or just pretend none of it was happening. But there was something in the visitors' expressions that prevented him from doing anything but being there. They seemed exhausted, as if they had traveled distances no human could comprehend. And even without words, Mark felt they were asking for more than shelter. They were asking for trust. Time passed slowly. The clock marked nearly midnight when the smallest began emitting a low sound, like a continuous whistle. The tallest responded with another tone, and then everything fell silent. Mark, leaning against the wall, felt the day's fatigue and the weight of the situation. He didn't know what to do. He just knew he couldn't leave them alone. He grabbed a bottle of water, placed it on the workbench, and said calmly, "You can drink if you want." One of them approached, picked up the container, and examined it as if it were a rare artifact. It turned it upside down, watched the water trickle out, and looked back at Mark, confused, like someone trying to understand the logic of another world. During the early hours of the morning, Mark didn't sleep. He watched, between fascination and fear, every movement of the visitors. With each passing minute, he realized that the most important thing there wasn't the difference between them, but what was the same. When he quietly asked where they came from, he felt a light pressure in his head, and images began to emerge, not words, but visions. A dark field covered in mist, an intense flash crossing the horizon, a sudden drop, and then absolute silence. He understood, even without knowing how. They were lost. They were travelers, or perhaps fugitives. Whatever had brought them there wasn't curiosity. It was necessity. Mark took a deep breath. Part of him wanted to run away. Another part wanted to protect those creatures as if they were his own children. There was no malice in their eyes, just contained fear. The smallest seemed to try to smile, tilting its head, imitating the human gestures it had observed. It was in that instant that Mark realized what stood before him wasn't a threat. It was a silent plea for help. Outside, the wind blew hard, shaking the dry trees. The sound of the desert seemed more distant, as if the entire world had paused to witness that unlikely encounter. Mark felt a strange peace, a connection that went beyond logic. It wasn't about understanding what they were, but about accepting what they were asking, and what that revealed about. As the smallest fell asleep under the blanket, Mark turned off the lights and sat in the dark, listening only to the steady breathing of the creatures. For the first time in a long time, he felt he wasn't alone. And that feeling, both unsettling and comforting, would stay with him for the rest of his life. Before we continue, if this video is useful to you, take a moment to subscribe, leave your like, and comment below. This helps this channel grow and ensures stories like this reach more people who also believe that the impossible can happen. The next morning, the desert sun invaded the garage with its harsh light, revealing the dust suspended in the air and the metallic outlines of scattered tools. Mark woke up in the chair, neck sore and the feeling of having dreamed something impossible. But upon opening his eyes, he realized it wasn't a dream. The three visitors were still there, motionless, silent, watching the light with a kind of childlike fascination. The smallest seemed a bit better, still covered with the old blanket, while the tallest remained near the unplugged heater, as if understanding its purpose. Mark scratched his head, trying to organize his thoughts. What should he do? Tell someone? Call the authorities? Part of him knew no one would believe it, and if they did, it might end badly. He'd seen enough on TV. Scientists, military, secret labs. He looked at the three again, and realized that, even without speaking, they seemed to understand what was going through his mind. One tilted its head, and made an almost human gesture, something between a nod and a silent plea. With a sigh, Mark opened the side door and let the light in fully. He grabbed 2 cans of soup and placed them on the workbench. "Food," he said, pointing. The visitors approached, curious, but didn't eat. They just touched the metal, felt the surface, and then returned it, as if trying to comprehend the meaning of sharing something. The smallest looked at him and pronounced, with a vibrant and hesitant voice, "With you." It was a broken phrase, but loaded with intent. Mark felt his chest tighten. They weren't asking for food. They were asking for permanence, refuge, perhaps even trust. The following hours were slow and dense. Time seemed to stretch inside that garage. Mark got closer, watching how the beings examined simple objects. A wrench, a piece of rubber, an old photo of his son hanging on the wall. The smallest touched the photo and pointed to the sky. Mark frowned, confused. He replied, "Family," and as if they understood, the three touched their own chests in an almost synchronized gesture. In that instant, he knew something had formed between them, a bond that didn't depend on words. In the days that followed, Mark's routine transformed. He left food, water, and blankets in the garage. He watched the visitors learn simple gestures. When he said friend, they repeated it by touching their chests. When he said home, they pointed to the sky. Little by little, they began to understand fragments of the human language, and Mark, without realizing it, spent hours talking to them, not like a scientist, but like someone trying to understand the other side of his own solitude. One night, while the wind cut through the desert silence, Mark heard the distant sound of propellers, drones, the kind local farmers used to monitor crops. He looked out the window and saw red lights blinking on the horizon. A chill ran through his body. The neighbor, old Harris, was suspicious and nosy. He'd seen movement in the garage days before and had asked, half-jokingly, if Mark was hiding government gold. Maybe now he was trying to find out what was really there. The tension grew. Mark knew that if someone found out, it would all end. Those beings would be taken away, studied, disassembled, perhaps destroyed, and he would be the man who handed over something the world wasn't ready to understand. For the first time, he realized he was in the middle of a choice that went beyond him. He could tell and relieve himself of the responsibility, or protect and risk everything. The fear was real, but something stronger was there, the certainty that you can't hand over what trusts you. When he looked at the three again, he saw the smallest holding the blanket and staring at him with eyes that seemed to reflect stars. Mark felt that in some way they understood what was happening, and without saying anything, he turned off all the lights, locked the garage, and promised himself he'd protect them. The world outside went on as usual. Drones, neighbors, silence, dust. But inside that small garage in the middle of nowhere, something extraordinary was happening. The impossible had become human, and for the first time, Mark realized that perhaps the true form of intelligence wasn't in those who travel between stars, but in those who choose to care for what they fear they don't understand. On the third night, the sky opened up in thunder and flashes that cut through the desert like blades of light. The electrical storm arrived without warning, and the wind howled between the windows of the old wooden house. The lamps flickered, the radio crackled with interference, and every sound seemed louder than normal, as if the world itself was about to reveal a secret. Mark was in the kitchen, watching the distant lightning through the window, when he heard dry, insistent knocks on the door. His heart raced. For a second, he thought it was the visitors, but the voice on the other side made him shudder. It was neighbor Harris, calling his name. When he opened the door, the old man was accompanied by two local policemen, flashlights in hand and tense expressions. "Harris said he saw strange movements in your garage," one of them said. "Lights, maybe people hiding. Can I take a look?" Mark tried to hide his nervousness. He forced a smile and replied in the most casual tone he could manage. "There's nothing much there, just some tools and a noisy generator. This storm must be distorting everything." But the policemen's gazes didn't soften. One insisted, "Can we check?" With no choice, Mark stepped aside. They crossed the yard as the wind kicked up dust and dry leaves. When the flashlight illuminated the garage door, Mark felt cold sweat trickle down his neck. He opened it slowly, mentally praying that the visitors had hidden. The light swept the interior, revealing the clean floor, hanging tools, and the old heater in the corner. No sign of the three, just the crumpled blanket on a chair. "See?" Mark said, trying to laugh. "Nothing but mess." The policeman looked around, suspicious, and the neighbor commented, "I swear I saw a blue light here last night." The policeman replied with boredom, "Lightning, Harris. It's the desert." "Sorry." When they finally left, Mark locked the door and took a deep breath. The silence that followed was too thick to be just silence. He whispered, "You can come out. They're gone." And as if they had been waiting for that signal, one of the figures emerged from the shadows, not from a corner of the garage, but from the darkness itself, as if matter had parted to reveal them. The largest approached, and without moving its lips, a voice sounded directly in Mark's mind. "You risk much for us," he replied in a low voice, feeling the knot tighten in his chest. "Sometimes it's worth it." For an instant, time seemed to stop. There was no fear. There was understanding. It was as if the universe itself had witnessed a silent pact between different worlds. The smallest approached, looked at Mark with something resembling tenderness, and touched his hand. The touch was cold, but carried a light vibration, almost human. Mark felt a wave of calm wash over his body, a kind of peace he didn't know existed. When dawn arrived, the desert was covered in fog. Mark opened the garage and noticed something new, a small metallic piece on the floor, near the heater. It was the size of a coin and emitted a faint, pulsing glow, almost imperceptible. He picked it up carefully and felt a slight shock, as if holding a miniature heart. He had no idea what it was, but instinctively knew he shouldn't get rid of it. When he looked at the spot where the visitors had slept, he noticed the air seemed to shimmer, as if still holding fragments of their presence. That morning, Mark couldn't work. He sat on the porch, watching the horizon and trying to understand what would happen next. He knew it was coming to an end, that the visitors were preparing to leave. The sky, now clear, seemed deeper, and the distant sound of the wind brought a kind of indescribable melancholy. He realized something inside him had changed. The fear of the unknown had been replaced by something rarer, faith in what can't be explained. And then, as if the universe confirmed his hunch, he saw a blue flash cross the sky and disappear into the desert. He stood there, frozen, not knowing whether to cry or smile. That light wasn't an end. It was just the announcement that the story wasn't over yet, and that perhaps the courage of an ordinary man was the link between two worlds. That night, the wind blew strong again, and the entire desert seemed to breathe along with the silence of the house. Mark had barely closed his eyes when he heard a soft sound coming from the garage, something between a whisper and a distant echo. He got up slowly, heart beating unevenly, and opened the door cautiously. There they were, the three visitors, gathered in the center of the garage, standing under the flickering yellowish light. The tallest approached, raising one hand in a gesture Mark already recognized as a greeting. This time, however, something was different. Their gaze was steady, determined, and the atmosphere carried a silent sadness, as if they were about to leave. The tallest looked directly at him and said, with the voice that seemed to come from all sides, "We must go, thank you." The words, though short, carried immense weight. Mark took a step forward, confused, unwilling to accept what he was hearing. "Go? Where? What if there's still danger?" he asked. But the smallest only replied with a low, echoing voice, "We are being followed." In that instant, an icy sensation ran through Mark's body. It wasn't fear of what pursued them, it was fear of losing them, because somehow he knew he would never see anything like it again. Mark's son, who had arrived that afternoon for the weekend, appeared at the door, sleepy, and froze at the scene. "Dad," he murmured, not understanding what he saw. Mark signaled for him to stay quiet. The smallest of the visitors walked up to the boy and observed him in silence, with that same curious gaze it had when looking at the photo days before. Then, it turned to Mark and approached slowly. Without saying anything, it pressed its forehead to his chest, a simple gesture, but so human that it made him shudder. Mark understood what it meant before even hearing the word family. His eyes welled up. There was no way to explain what he felt. It was as if, for a brief instant, everything strange became familiar, and the entire universe fit into that silent touch. He tried to respond, but the words wouldn't come. The tallest raised its hand again and said, "You gave us shelter. This will never be forgotten." The air began to change. An intense glow spread through the garage, not like electric light, but like something alive, a clarity that seemed to pulse from the inside out. Mark stepped back, shielding his eyes, and felt his son grab his hand. The luminosity grew until it filled the entire space, and a soft sound like a distant choir filled the room. There was no pain, just a sensation of expansion, of presence. And then, as quickly as it began, everything went dark. The silence returned. When Mark opened his eyes, the garage was empty. On the floor, 3 circular marks still glowed, burned into the concrete. The blanket remained folded in a corner, and the small metallic piece he had found before now pulsed stronger, as if saying they were still nearby. Mark looked at his son, who was still in shock, and neither said anything. They stood there, in silence, for long minutes, hearing only the sound of the wind cutting through the early morning. There was no proof, no photograph, no testimony that could translate what they had lived, but they knew something extraordinary had happened. When the sun rose, the sky was a nearly translucent blue. Mark went out to the yard and looked at the horizon. The desert seemed the same, dry, still, indifferent. And yet, everything was different. There was something in the air, a lightness hard to explain. He knew that from that night on, he would never see the world the same way, because deep down, he understood that the encounter hadn't been just between different species, but between two forms of solitude that for a brief instant chose to trust each other. Mark took a deep breath, gaze fixed on the point where the sky met the earth. There, where the desert swallowed the horizon line, he swore he saw 3 points of light moving away slowly until they disappeared completely. He didn't know if it was illusion or farewell, but in his heart remained the certainty that somehow that connection would never be. The impossible had happened, and he had said yes. In the weeks that followed, everyday life tried to resume its rhythm, but nothing seemed the same. Mark kept going to work, fixing engines and changing tires, but his mind wandered. The garage, once just a shelter for tools and solitude, now seemed to carry an invisible presence. Sometimes, when the sun set and the air began to cool, he felt a light shiver, as if the space still remembered what had happened there. The first sign came in the early hours of one morning. Mark woke to a snap from the kitchen, a clear but light sound, like a short electrical discharge. He got up and noticed the old radio on top of the fridge was on by itself. White noise filled the room, and between the crackle, something began to form. Words. Not out loud, but in a metallic whisper, repeated twice, growing clearer each time. "Thank you for letting us stay." He stood frozen, not moving a muscle. The words were simple, but they echoed with a weight he would never feel. The radio turned off by itself right after, leaving an almost sacred silence. In the following days, other signs began to appear. The porch lights blinked always at the same time, 10:11 p.m. Sometimes, the kitchen clock would stop for exactly 5 minutes, then start working again, without explanation. Mark began noting everything in a notebook, trying to make sense of what he saw. But more than fear, what he felt was a strange peace. It was as if the visitors were just saying, "We're still here." A local journalist, known for investigating unusual stories, showed up one afternoon. He said he'd heard rumors about lights in the desert and wanted to hear the account straight from the source. Mark hesitated, but ended up telling part of what he'd lived, omitting details to protect what he felt was sacred. The reporter published a simple article titled, "The Night They Asked to Stay." The text spread across the internet in a few days. No one knew if it was fiction or truth, but that didn't matter. People saw themselves in the story, not because of the extraterrestrials, but because of the act of kindness, the idea that someone, faced with the unknown, chose to welcome instead of fear, touched thousands of hearts. Mark didn't care about the opinion. He wasn't seeking fame or credit. For him, all that mattered was the feeling that something inside him had changed forever. He began receiving letters from people saying the story had inspired them, that they had helped strangers because it reminded them that opening the door can change someone's destiny. That moved him more than he'd like to admit. It was as if, by welcoming the stranger that night, he had awakened a dormant humanity, not just in him, but in many. One early morning, he went to the garage and sat in the chair where he'd slept that first night. The metallic object the visitors had left was still there, kept inside a small box. He took it out and observed it. It glowed faintly, with an almost imperceptible pulse. When he held it, he heard the same voice from the radio again, but clearer now, as if coming from within him. "You didn't give shelter, you gave home." Mark closed his eyes. He felt a hot tear roll down, and he smiled. The news about the article gained traction on social media. Videos, posts, theories, all tried to explain what had happened in that small Arizona town. Some mocked it, others believed. But between the skepticism and faith, what remained was the message. A story about a man who chose not to be afraid. A reminder that the unknown sometimes just wants a place to rest. Mark, over time, stepped away from public attention. He returned to living simply, in the same rhythm as always. But at night, when the desert sky opened up in points of light, he watched for a long time. Sometimes, he saw 3 stars moving in formation, as if dancing slowly in the darkness. He knew they weren't stars, and each time he saw them, he felt the same certainty that had accompanied him since that night. Somehow, they still remembered him. Somehow, he was never truly alone again. Years passed, and time left its marks on Mark Reynolds' skin and gaze. His hair, once dark and thick, was now almost entirely grey, and his hands bore the scars of a life of work, solitude, and, in silence, a secret only he understood. The world had changed. Drones crossed the skies casually, and news about sightings no longer caused much astonishment. Still, no one had ever told a story like his, because most people believed encounters between humans and the unknown could only be marked by fear, conflict, or scientific curiosity. But Mark knew that sometimes the extraordinary chooses to manifest through something simple, like the act of opening a door. That fall of 2022, the wind blew dry again, like the year it all happened. Mark was sitting on the porch, drinking coffee, when an old car pulled up in front of his house. Out came a family, a couple and a little girl, faces marked by fatigue and dust. The man approached slowly, with a distressed expression, and explained they had lost their home in a fire. "We don't know where to go. We just need a place for this night," the father said, almost apologizing for being there. Mark was silent for a few seconds. He looked at the woman, who held her daughter in her arms, and felt a knot tighten in his chest. It was as if time had folded back on itself, bringing back that same scene from 8 years ago. The unlikely request, the gaze of someone who just wants shelter, and the chance to respond again. He took a deep breath and without hesitation said the words that had once changed his life. "You can stay, just for tonight." The man looked at him surprised, not understanding the weight of that phrase. But Mark knew. He knew the universe sometimes repeats the same gestures to test if we're still capable of choosing kindness. He led the family to the garage, now clean and renovated, and turned on the light. As they settled in, the girl looked around curiously and pointed to a small metallic box on the workbench. "What's that?" she asked. Mark smiled faintly. "It's just something a friend left." When night fell, he sat on the porch, listening to the desert wind. The sky was clear, full of stars. He watched in silence until 3 luminous points began to move, exactly as they had years before. A streak of light crossed the firmament and disappeared behind the mountain. Mark felt a light shiver, not of fear, but of recognition. It was as if the universe had just whispered, "We're still here." He stayed there for a few minutes, at peace. He thought about how many times humans close doors out of fear of what they don't understand. He also thought about how a simple choice, opening or not opening, can change not just one night, but someone's entire destiny. In that isolated house in Arizona, Mark finally understood what that visit had meant. The true mystery was never about where they came from, but about what they left in him. The certainty that the greatest power a being can have is to offer shelter, even without guarantees, even without answers. And when the clock struck 10:11 p.m., the same time the lights had blinked on their own for years, Mark stood up, looked at the sky and murmured, "Thank you for reminding me." He went back inside with a serene smile, the kind of smile from someone who understands that the extraordinary doesn't always come in ships or lights, but sometimes arrives in the form of a simple request. Can we stay for this night? If this story touched you in some way, leave your like, subscribe, and share it with someone who also believes the universe speaks, sometimes in the most unlikely voices. Because maybe one day someone will knock on your door, and what you decide in that instant could change more than you imagine.